An der Front in Nordafrika. Der Spähtrupp einer Vorausabteilung stößt in die Wüste vor. Er soll feststellen, ob eine Oase in der südlichen Flanke unserer Front vom Feind besetzt ist. Reifenspuren im Wüstensand. Sie werden nachgemessen. Das Profil muss englischen Ursprungs sein. Der Feind kann in der Nähe sein. Sprungweise pirscht sich der Spähtrupp an die Oase heran. Es besteht keine Gefahr. Die Ortschaft ist vom Feinde frei. Die Bevölkerung begrüßt die deutschen Soldaten. Der Abteilungsarzt.
In the spring of 1942, one German reconnaissance commander filed a report that his superiors refused to believe. He claimed that a British armored car, a scout vehicle, not a tank, had ambushed his column, destroyed 2 half-tracks, and disappeared before anyone could return fire. His commanding officer told him to recheck his identification. Everyone knew British armored cars ran from contact. That was doctrine. That was reality. Except it wasn't anymore. And nobody had told the Germans yet. Libya, 1942. The sun has barely cleared the horizon, and already the heat is pressing down on the sand like a physical weight. A British reconnaissance patrol is moving east, slow and careful, wheels cutting shallow tracks that the wind will erase within the hour. Then the spotter sees them. German half-tracks, moving in column, 400 yards out and closing. In any other armored car in the British inventory at that moment, the drill was automatic. You do not engage. You report the contact. You turn around. You run. That is what reconnaissance does. That is what reconnaissance has always done. Observe, report, survive. The moment you stop running, you die. But the crew of this vehicle did not turn around. The commander spoke quietly into the intercom. The gunner traversed the turret. The driver held the car perfectly still. A 40mm shell left the barrel at 792 meters per second. The half-track burst into flames. The British car was already moving before the smoke cleared, reversing into a shallow depression in the sand, guns still pointing forward, the driver never once turning his back to the enemy. 30 seconds later, the car repositioned. It fired again. Then it was gone. The German crews who survived that morning filed a report that confused their commanding officer. The description did not match any known British armored car. It moved like a scout vehicle, but it fought like a tank. They were not wrong, and they were not right. What they had encountered was something new, something that should not have existed, something that the entire engineering establishment of Europe had concluded was impossible to build. To understand why that matters, you have to go back, not to the desert, not to the war. You have to go back to a problem that the British Army had been quietly failing to solve for 3 years. Reconnaissance is the nervous system of an army. Without it, a commander is blind. He does not know where the enemy is. He does not know how many. He does not know if they are advancing or retreating, concentrated or dispersed. Every decision he makes is a guess. And in war, guesses kill people. The British Army understood this. Every army understood this. The solution, in theory, was simple, fast. Lightly armored vehicles that could push ahead of the main force, find the enemy, and report back without being destroyed. In practice, by 1940, the British solution was not working. The Marmon Harrington armored car carried a boy's anti-tank rifle. The weapon was heavy. Its recoil punished the gunner every time he fired it. At any realistic combat distance, it lacked the penetration to reliably stop German armored vehicles. It was, in the words of men who used it, a weapon that looked serious without being serious. The Humber mounted a 15mm Besa machine gun, better than nothing, marginally better than nothing, against German vehicles protected by real steel. It was the difference between a bruise and a broken bone. It hurt. It did not stop. The Morris carried the boy's rifle and a Bren gun. The Bren was a fine infantry weapon. It had no place in armored warfare. When British reconnaissance patrols encountered German armored cars equipped with 20mm autocannons, the exchange was not a fight. It was a demonstration. The Germans could engage at ranges where the British weapons were useless. They could maneuver freely. Knowing the British could not hurt them, they could take their time. British crews knew this. They knew it before they climbed into their vehicles. They knew it as they drove forward into enemy territory. They knew that if they found what they were looking for, the finding might kill them. And that knowledge did something that no enemy bullet had done. It broke the reconnaissance function from the inside. Senior officers in British armored car regiments began reporting a problem that no one wanted to put in writing directly. Finding volunteers for forward patrol was becoming difficult. Men who were not cowards, men who had already proven their courage, were quietly asking to be assigned elsewhere, not because the mission was dangerous. All missions were dangerous, but because the mission felt pointless. You were being asked to find the enemy in a vehicle that could not fight the enemy. You were being asked to gather intelligence that would help other men win battles you could not participate in. You were the eyes of the army, except that the eyes kept getting shot out. Intelligence suffered. Commanders made decisions based on incomplete information. Units moved into positions they should not have occupied because no one knew what was waiting there. The inadequacy of the tools was creating a cascade of failures that went far beyond the technical. The British needed a different answer. The answer everyone had already tried to find and failed to find. Here is the problem, stated plainly. An armored car needs to be fast enough to escape when it has to. It needs to be light enough to maintain that speed across difficult terrain. And it needs to be armed well enough to destroy enemy vehicles. Every serious engineer who looked at this problem reached the same conclusion. You can have two of those qualities. You cannot have all three. The physics will not allow it. A weapon heavy enough to destroy armor is too heavy to carry on a fast-wheeled vehicle without destroying the suspension and killing the top speed. The recoil forces involved will shake the chassis apart over time. The ammunition storage required consumes space and adds weight that compounds every other problem. And the moment you start adding armor to protect the crew of this now heavily armed vehicle, you have built a tank, a slow tank, on wheels. The Americans looked at this problem and gave their M8 Greyhound a 37mm gun with minimal armor, acceptable firepower, acceptable speed, 3 to 6 millimeters of floor protection that made it catastrophically vulnerable to mines, and an open-topped turret that left crews exposed to shell fragments, grenades, and weather in the same way as the German vehicles they faced. British crews who were issued M8s lined the floors with sandbags. That tells you everything. The Germans built the S-DKZ 222 with a 20mm autocannon and an open-topped turret, effective against light vehicles, useless against anything with genuine protection. German doctrine also instructed reconnaissance units to avoid decisive engagement regardless of what their vehicles could do. Even when they had superior equipment, they were told not to use it aggressively. No nation had solved it. No nation expected it to be solved. And then a bicycle company in Coventry decided to try. The Birmingham Small Arms Company, known as BSA, did not build tanks. They built motorcycles, bicycles. They had won a contract in 1938 to produce the Daimler Dingo, a tiny two-man scout car meant purely for observation work. The dingo was not a weapon. It was a vehicle for seeing things and driving away. But the engineering team at the Daimler Company, a subsidiary operating within the BSA Group, looked at what they had built and asked a question that none of the established weapons manufacturers were asking. What if we scaled this up and put a real gun on it? Not a machine gun, not an autocannon, a proper anti-tank weapon, the kind of gun that goes on a tank. Every rational voice said the same thing. The weight will kill your speed. The recoil will destroy the chassis. You'll end up with something too slow to scout and too weak to fight. You'll build a compromise that does nothing well. Daimler's engineering team did not stop asking. In April 1939, they began work on what they called in internal documentation, the light tank wheeled. That name was deliberate. This was not an armored car that pretended to have firepower. This was a tank that happened to move on wheels. The distinction mattered to the people building it. The gun they chose was the Ordnance QF 2-pounder, 40 millimeters. The same weapon fitted to the Crusader tank. The same weapon fitted to the Valentine. This was not a compromise caliber. It fired armor-piercing rounds at 792 meters per second, with penetration sufficient to destroy any German armored car and most early Panzer models at combat ranges. No reconnaissance vehicle on Earth carried anything comparable. The turret drew on the same engineering lineage as the light tank series, sharing its configuration with vehicles like the Tetrarch, but was a purpose-built design for the Daimler rather than a direct transplant from any existing tank. Nobody had written a rule against borrowing that blueprint. The absence of prohibition became permission. And that is the first thing you need to understand about this vehicle. The Daimler armored car was not born from genius. It was born from the refusal to accept an answer that everyone else had already accepted. The vehicle that emerged from Daimler's drawing rooms weighed 7,600 kilograms, nearly twice the weight of the dingo it was based upon. That weight created engineering problems that cascaded through every system. The transmission was the first crisis. A vehicle this heavy, driven hard across desert terrain, up gradients, at combat speeds, needed a gearbox that could absorb punishment without the driver adding to it. Standard manual transmissions required clutch work, timing, physical effort. In combat, the driver has other things to think about. Stalling the engine at the wrong moment was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Their solution was a Wilson pre-selector gearbox combined with a fluid flywheel. The driver selected the next gear before he needed it. When the moment came, a tap of the pedal engaged it instantly. The fluid coupling meant the engine could not stall, not in sand, not on a hillside, not while reversing away from a burning vehicle at full speed. 5 forward gears, 5 reverse gears, identical performance in both directions. That last detail sounds minor. It was not minor. It meant that a Daimler crew could engage the enemy, fire, and then drive backward at full speed without turning the vehicle around. The gun stayed pointing at the threat. The crew stayed behind the armor. The driver never exposed the less protected rear of the vehicle to the enemy. This was not an accident of engineering. It was a deliberate tactical decision built into the mechanical design. The drivetrain used an H-drive arrangement. Individual propeller shafts ran to each wheel. Epicyclic reduction gearing in the hubs multiplied torque at the point where it was needed. The result was a wheeled vehicle that could climb a 50% gradient. That is a slope steep enough to stop most tracked vehicles. Independent coil spring suspension on all 4 wheels gave cross-country mobility that consistently surprised people who watched it move. Girling hydraulic disc brakes completed the system. In 1941, disc brakes on a military vehicle were advanced technology. They were not chosen because they were fashionable. They were chosen because the vehicle's performance demanded stopping power that drum brakes could not reliably provide. The engine was a 95 horsepower Daimler unit. It pushed the car to 50 miles per hour on road. The operational range was 200 miles. Speed, firepower, mobility. The thing that could not be done had been done. Production began in April 1941 at Daimler's Radford Works in Coventry. Coventry was already a target. The city's industrial concentration made it valuable to bomb, and the Luftwaffe had already demonstrated that it understood this. Through the spring of 1941, Luftwaffe raids targeting the Midlands forced Daimler to disperse manufacturing before full production could take hold. Daimler had a vehicle that worked. They had orders to fill. They no longer had a single factory capable of building it. What followed was a dispersal of manufacturing that would have seemed farcical in peacetime. Final assembly moved to Wolverhampton. Gearboxes were produced at a hosiery mill in Leek. Turrets were manufactured at an underwear factory in Colville. The most dangerous reconnaissance vehicle the British Army would field in the Second World War was assembled, in part, on production lines that had previously made civilian goods from hosiery mills to clothing factories. No one planned this. No one considered it ideal. The workers who operated those lines had no military background and no experience with armored vehicles. Quality control in a dispersed manufacturing network spread across central England was a daily problem. And yet, 135 vehicles were completed in 1941, 721 in 1942. By the end of the war, 2,694 Daimler armored cars had been delivered to British units fighting on every front where the British Army operated. The machine that the established weapons manufacturers said was impossible to build was being assembled in hosiery mills and underwear factories and delivered in numbers that the manufacturers who refused to try could not have matched. That is not a story about engineering genius. That is a story about what happens when you refuse the consensus answer long enough to find out if it is actually true. The answer, it turned out, was waiting in the desert. And the men of the 11th Hussars were about to find out exactly what they had been given. The 11th Hussars had a nickname that predated the war by more than a century: cherry pickers. The name came from a Spanish orchard in 1811 where French cavalry had surprised a detachment of the regiment foraging for fruit. The Hussars fought their way out. They kept the nickname because British soldiers have always understood that the best way to survive embarrassment is to own it completely. By 1942, the cherry pickers were one of the most experienced reconnaissance units in the British Army. They had been in North Africa since before the serious fighting started. They had watched the Desert War evolve from skirmishes into something industrial in its violence. They had driven every armored car the British Army had issued them, and they had learned the hard lesson that every reconnaissance crew in every army was learning at the same time. Speed alone does not keep you alive. When the 11th Hussars received their Daimlers in early 1942, there was no ceremony. No formal doctrine update accompanied the vehicles. No staff officer arrived with a new manual explaining how these cars should be used differently from the ones they replaced. The vehicles were delivered. The regiment signed for them. And then the regiment did what cavalry has always done. They rode out to see what the new horses could do. The Western Desert is the closest thing to a naval battlefield that land warfare has ever produced. There are no fixed lines. There are no defensible cities. There are no forests to hide in, no rivers to anchor a flank, no high ground that cannot be outflanked by a force willing to accept the logistical difficulty of going around it. Two armies move across the sand the way two fleets move across the ocean, seeking advantage, seeking position, seeking the moment when the enemy is exposed and cannot recover. In this environment, reconnaissance is not a supporting function. It is the primary function. The commander who knows where the enemy is holds every advantage. The commander who does not is fighting blind against an opponent who can see. Rommel understood this better than almost anyone on either side. His reconnaissance was aggressive, persistent, and deep. His armored car crews operated with an initiative that their British counterparts struggled to match, partly because of training, partly because of doctrine, and partly because German vehicles could threaten British reconnaissance cars in ways that British vehicles could not threaten back. That asymmetry was about to end. The first patrols with the new Daimlers confirmed what the engineering suggested, but what no one fully believed until they saw it. At 400 yards, the two-pounder could destroy an SG-22 with a single shot. The German vehicle's 20mm autocannon, at that same distance, could mark the Daimler's 14mm frontal armor, but could not reliably penetrate it. The British crews were not just better armed. They were operating inside a margin of safety that had never previously existed, but the margin revealed something else. Something that no one had written into any doctrine. The 11th Hussars had not been given new tactics to go with their new vehicles. The standing orders were unchanged. Reconnaissance units observed. Reconnaissance units reported. Reconnaissance units withdrew from contact rather than becoming decisively engaged. Those orders existed because previous vehicles could not survive decisive engagement. The orders had been written around the limitations of inferior equipment. The equipment was no longer inferior. And the men sitting in those vehicles understood something before their commanders fully articulated it. They understood it the first time they held their ground when a German armored car appeared on the horizon and did not advance, uncertain of what it was facing. They understood it when they flanked a moving column and hit a half-track from 200 yards and watched it stop and burn and saw the German crews running without returning fire because they did not know where the shot had come from. The Daimler did not give the 11th Hussars new orders. It gave them a choice they had never had before. And they made that choice on their own, patrol by patrol, engagement by engagement, in the space between what doctrine permitted and what the vehicle made possible. This was not heroism. This was pragmatism. Dead men do not collect intelligence. Crews who could fight back survived longer than crews who only ran. And crews who survived longer gathered more information, built more experience, developed better judgment. The aggressive use of the Daimler was not recklessness. It was the rational response to finally having a tool that matched the task. The 2nd Derbyshire Yeomanry worked the flanks of the El Alamein position throughout the critical months of 1942. Their job was to keep German reconnaissance away from Allied positions while simultaneously gathering information about Rommel's dispositions. They were a screen, and they were collectors, and they were doing both tasks simultaneously with a vehicle that made both tasks possible at once. German reconnaissance units that had previously operated with something approaching impunity began filing reports about British armored car activity that confused their commanders. The British were not withdrawing. The British were engaging. The British were appearing in places where British vehicles had no business being, staying longer than they should have been able to stay, and then disappearing before German armor could be brought up to deal with them. The psychological effect compounded over weeks and months. German scouts who had learned to operate aggressively, confident in their weapons' superiority, began to hesitate. The hesitation was small, but in reconnaissance, small hesitations produce large intelligence failures. A patrol that slows down a kilometer earlier than it should misses the supply dump. A commander who does not know where the supply dump is makes the wrong decision about when to advance. The King's Dragoon Guards pushed further into enemy territory than previous armored cars had allowed, engaging targets of opportunity that would previously have required a withdrawal request and an artillery mission. They were doing reconnaissance the way cavalry had done it before the industrial age, made mounted combat suicidal, probing and striking and pulling back, keeping the enemy uncertain and off balance. The pursuit from El Alamein, across Libya, and into Tunisia in late 1942 and early 1943 was where this accumulation of small advantages became visible as a strategic reality. Daimler crews were killing German half-tracks, armored cars, and soft-skinned vehicles across hundreds of miles of desert, not in set-piece battles, in the running, scrappy, unglamorous work of pursuit, where one side is pressing and the other side is holding together whatever it can. An Imperial War Museum photograph from January 1943 shows a Daimler firing in the gray pre-dawn light at the beginning of the battle for Tripoli. The image is not dramatic. The car is barely visible. The gun flash is the brightest thing in the frame. It looks like exactly what it was, a crew doing their job before breakfast in the dark because the job needed to be done. But the desert also revealed the machine's limitations. And understanding those limitations requires a pause, because this is where the story stops being simple. The SDFZ234/2, the Puma. On paper, the Puma was the better vehicle. Its 50mm gun offered significantly greater penetration than the 2-pounder. 30mm of frontal armor provided real protection against the weapons most likely to engage it. 8-wheel drive delivered outstanding cross-country mobility and a range of 1,000 kilometers that made British logistics officers envious. Post-war analysts regularly assessed it as the most capable armored car produced by any nation during the conflict. The Daimler could not reliably penetrate the Puma's frontal armor at typical engagement ranges. The Puma could penetrate the Daimler. In a direct head-to-head encounter between a well-handled Puma and a well-handled Daimler, the Puma held the advantage. This is where the story requires honesty. 101 Pumas were ever built, 101, against 2,694 Daimlers, a ratio of roughly 26-1. The Puma existed as a demonstration of what German engineering could produce when resources and priorities aligned. The Daimler existed as a demonstration of what British manufacturing could sustain when a design was sound enough to produce consistently and in quantity. Military history is filled with the finest weapons that lost wars because they could not be built fast enough or in numbers large enough to matter. It is also filled with good enough weapons that won because they could be built at scale, kept running in difficult conditions, and replaced when they were lost. The Daimler was not the best armored car of the war. It was the right armored car for the war the British were actually fighting. There is also the matter of doctrine. German tactical doctrine instructed reconnaissance units to avoid decisive engagement. This was not incompetence. It was a considered philosophy. Scouts gather information. They do not consume themselves in fights that infantry and armor are better positioned to win. The philosophy was coherent. But it meant that even when German crews had superior vehicles, doctrine discouraged the aggressive use of those vehicles. The Puma, in the hands of crews told to observe and withdraw, was less dangerous than its specifications suggested. The Daimler, in the hands of crews who had discovered by experience that their vehicle could fight effectively, was more dangerous than anyone anticipated. The machine does not make the doctrine, but the doctrine shapes what the machine can do. And on that balance, through 1943, the British were winning. June 6, 1944. The English Channel at dawn. Sea Squadron of the Inns of Court Regiment crossed the Channel as part of the vast armada descending on the Normandy coast. Their orders were direct and aggressive, characteristic of the confidence that the desert experience had built into British reconnaissance units. They were to land with the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division on Juno Beach, push inland through the chaos of the assault, and reach the bridges over the Orne River. The distance from this beach to the bridges was approximately 20 kilometers. 20 kilometers in a country the regiment had never seen, against defenses that no amount of aerial photography had fully mapped, on a day when everything that could go wrong was going wrong simultaneously. The first Daimlers were destroyed within hours of landing. Mines, an 88mm gun positioned to cover a beach exit. The congestion of thousands of men and vehicles trying to move through gaps in the beach obstacles at the same time. The desert had taught these crews to use speed and maneuver to stay alive. The beach gave them no room for speed and no room for maneuver. Men died on Juno Beach who had survived 2 years in North Africa. The vehicle that had given them a fighting chance in open desert could not make the ground flat, could not remove the mines, could not silence the artillery. The regiment took casualties within hours of landing. The objectives were not reached on schedule, and yet the regiment pushed inland, Later assessments recorded that they had covered themselves in glory, which is the kind of phrase that military reports use when they want to acknowledge that men did everything that could be asked of them in circumstances that were asking too much. The Daimler had not failed. The situation had exceeded what any vehicle could solve. But Normandy's real challenge was not the beach. It was what came after, the bocage. The Norman countryside behind the beaches was ancient farmland divided by hedgerows that had been growing in place for centuries. These were not decorative hedges. They were earthen banks, sometimes 2 meters high, topped with dense vegetation and root systems that had been compressing and hardening for generations. They divided the landscape into small fields, connected by sunken lanes, just wide enough for a single vehicle. The desert had rewarded speed and reach, and the ability to engage at distance. The bocage punished every one of those qualities. Visibility measured in meters, not kilometers. Routes that channeled movement into predictable corridors. Positions that could not be flanked without finding a gap in the hedgerows. And gaps could be covered by a single machine gun. The tactics that had made the Daimler lethal in Libya were nearly useless in Normandy. And here is where the lesson sharpens into something permanent. The Inns of Court Regiment, working through the bocage in the weeks after D-Day, developed a solution that appeared in no manual and was authorized by no staff officer. They began removing the turrets from some of their Daimlers entirely. These vehicles, called SOD cars by the crews who operated them, lost their firepower in exchange for a dramatically reduced silhouette. A turreted armored car moving through a bocage lane was visible from the moment it entered the lane. Its height made it obvious. Its profile betrayed its position to anyone watching the hedgerow line. A D-turreted Daimler was lower, quieter in its visual signature, harder to track. They were command vehicles now, observation platforms. The gun was gone, but the chassis, the transmission, the suspension, the mobility in reverse, the fundamental mechanical competence of the design, all of that remained. The crews who made this modification understood something that the designers in Coventry could not have anticipated in 1939. The vehicle was not defined by any single configuration. The engineering was robust enough to absorb changes that would have broken a less capable design. The bocage did not defeat the Daimler. It changed how the Daimler was used. And the Daimler was capable of being changed. September 1944. The Allied armies were moving east with a momentum that 6 weeks earlier would have seemed impossible. Paris had fallen. The Germans were retreating across France and Belgium and into the Netherlands, trying to consolidate on lines they could actually hold, trying to rebuild formations that had been shattered in the Falaise pocket, trying to do everything at once and succeeding at none of it. In this kind of warfare, the force that moves fastest wins the most. Reconnaissance units were the tip of that speed. The 1st Belgian Armored Car Squadron was part of the Piron Brigade, the Belgian unit fighting under British command, composed of Belgians who had escaped their occupied country and spent years training for the moment they could return to it. They drove Daimlers. They had been given British vehicles, British equipment, British doctrine, integrated into a British formation, but they were going home. On the 3rd of September 1944, Lieutenant Roger de Wandre crossed into Brussels. His Daimler was named Calamity. It was the first Allied armored vehicle to enter the Belgian capital after 4 years of German occupation. The city erupted. 4 years of occupation accumulates in people in ways that cannot be fully described. 4 years of curfews and rationing, and the particular humiliation of watching an enemy army march through your streets with the casual confidence of permanent residents. 4 years of calculating every word before you spoke it in public. 4 years of learning to read the mood of soldiers who could arrest you for nothing, and of learning not to look at them when they passed. And then, on a September morning, a British armored car named Calamity drove through the streets of Brussels with a Belgian officer in the commander's hatch. The crowds that surrounded de Wandre's vehicle were not celebrating an abstraction. They were not celebrating the Allied cause or the liberation of Europe or the defeat of fascism. They were celebrating the specific physical fact that the occupation was over and they were still alive. Deandre was Belgian. He had been away for 4 years. He was coming home in a British vehicle, wearing a British-style uniform, in a brigade that was technically part of the British order of battle. 3 layers of identity compressed into a single moment. The man was Belgian. The machine was British. The cause was European. And all of it was riding on a pre-selector gearbox designed by engineers in Coventry who had never imagined this particular street on this particular morning. The Pyrrhon Brigade continued fighting through the Netherlands and into Germany. Their Daimlers kept moving. The liberation of Brussels was not the end of the war for them. It was a moment they carried with them into everything that came after. 3 weeks later, the limits of everything became visible at once. Operation Market Garden was the largest airborne operation in history. 35,000 men dropped from the sky across the Netherlands in an attempt to seize bridges over the Rhine and create a corridor for British armor to advance into Germany. The plan was ambitious. It was also dependent on a ground advance moving faster than the terrain and German resistance would allow. The 2nd Household Cavalry Regiment was given the task of scouting for Executex Corps, the armored formation assigned to drive north through the narrow corridor created by the airborne landings. Their Daimlers pushed ahead of the main column, probing German positions, identifying routes, reporting what they found. On the 22nd of September, Household Cavalry Daimlers linked with Polish paratroopers at Driel, having navigated around German positions that had stopped other formations. The reconnaissance was, by the technical standards of the mission, successful. They found the route. They made the contact. They delivered the information. The information did not save the operation. The paratroopers at Arnhem had been holding for 9 days by then. They were fighting with what they had landed with, which was far less than they needed, against German forces that had been far stronger and far more organized than the intelligence assessments predicted. By the time the Household Cavalry Daimlers reached Driel, Arnhem was already lost. The bridge that the operation was designed to capture and hold had been contested, taken, and retaken in fighting of extraordinary intensity by men who were running out of everything. The operation failed. Nearly 8,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The Rhine Bridge at Arnhem was not taken. The war in the West would continue for another 8 months. The Daimler crews had done their jobs. Their jobs were not enough. A good tool used well by competent people cannot compensate for a strategic plan that asks more of the situation than the situation will give. The Daimler had changed what British reconnaissance could do. It had not changed the fundamental arithmetic of the battle, in which the Germans had more strength in the right places than Market Garden's planners had accounted for. The crews drove home from Driel through the same narrow roads they had advanced on. The failure was not theirs. The failure was structural, architectural, built into the plan before the first parachute opened. They had found what they were sent to find. The finding had not been enough. Military history is full of moments like this, the finest performance of the finest unit in service of a plan that cannot succeed. The Daimler at Market Garden is one of those moments. It does not diminish what the crews accomplished. It does not elevate it into something it was not. It simply shows the exact boundary of what the machine and the men inside it could do. They could find the enemy. They could fight the enemy. They could not fix a broken strategy by the quality of their reconnaissance. There is one more piece of the technical story that belongs in late 1944 because it shows what happens when a capable platform meets a problem that the original design did not anticipate. By the autumn of 1944, the Daimler's 2-pounder gun was aging in a way that the Desert War had partly concealed. In North Africa, the primary targets had been German armored cars, half-tracks, and light vehicles. The 2-pounder handled all of those adequately, but Northwest Europe was full of heavier German armor, Panzer IVs, Stug assault guns. The vehicles that the Daimler crews were now likely to encounter were protected by armor that the standard 2-pounder could not reliably penetrate at combat ranges. The answer was the Little John adapter, The device took its name from an anglicization of the surname of its Czech designer, Janáček. It was a taper bore attachment fitted to the muzzle of the existing gun that squeezed a specially designed projectile with a soft alloy skirt down to a smaller diameter as it exited, dramatically increasing muzzle velocity and armor penetration. The installation required no modification to the vehicle, no new turret, no new gun, no time in a maintenance depot. A crew could fit it in the field, the adapter attached to the barrel they already had. The limitations were real. Tungsten was scarce, which meant the special ammunition was scarce. When the Little John adapter was fitted, the gun could not fire standard 2-pounder ammunition or high-explosive shells. It was purely an anti-armor configuration. A crew fitting the adapter was making a specific tactical choice today. We may need to fight heavier armor, and we are accepting all other limitations to be ready for that. The design had proven capable of growing with the war. The vehicles that had been adequate in 1942 were marginal in 1944. The Daimler was not immune to this, but it remained adaptable in ways that most vehicles were not, because the people who built it had solved the original problem correctly. When the fundamentals are right, the platform can be extended. When the fundamentals are wrong, no attachment saves it. 3 battlefields, 3 versions of the same lesson. In the desert, the lesson was that a vehicle capable of fighting changes what reconnaissance can accomplish, not by transforming scouts into tank crews, but by giving scouts the option to stand and fight when standing and fighting was the right choice. And removing that option had made reconnaissance dangerous, incomplete, and corrosive to morale. In Normandy, the lesson was that no vehicle solves every problem, and the measure of a good design is not that it works everywhere without modification, but that it is capable of being modified by the people who depend on it. The SOD cars were improvisation born of necessity. They were also evidence that the Daimler's engineering was robust enough to remain useful even when everything that made it distinctive as a weapons platform was removed. At Arnhem, the lesson was the hardest one. The lesson that no amount of mechanical excellence, tactical skill, or individual courage can substitute for strategic coherence. The household cavalry Daimlers reached Driel. Arnhem fell. Both of those things are true, and neither one cancels the other. The men who drove those vehicles across 3 continents and through 6 years of war were not given a perfect machine. They were given a machine that was better than the alternative, maintained by an industrial system that kept producing it when the factory was threatened, adapted by crews who understood it well enough to change it when the original design did not fit the ground they were standing on. Hamburg was waiting, and the regiment that had first trusted these vehicles in the desert was going to be the one to drive them into the heart of the Reich. Hamburg, May 3rd, 1945, 5 days before Germany surrendered. The 11th Hussars led the 7th Armored Division into the city through streets that had been bombed into something that no longer resembled streets, rubble piled against what remained of buildings, fires still burning in places where fires had been burning for days, a population that had lived underground for months emerging into light that felt dangerous and uncertain, not yet understanding what peace meant, not yet sure that this was peace and not simply a pause. The cherry pickers drove through all of it. The same regiment that had signed for the first Daimlers in early 1942 in the dust of North Africa, under a sun that bleached everything to the color of old bone. The same regiment that had spent 3 years proving, engagement by engagement and patrol by patrol, that a wheeled vehicle could do things that doctrine said wheeled vehicles could not do. They were driving the same model of car, different vehicles, obviously, worn, repaired, replaced, but the same design, the same transmission, the same turret, the same fundamental answer to the question that Daimler's engineers had refused to stop asking in 1939. From El Alamein to Hamburg, from the Libyan desert to the ruins of the Reich, no other British armored car had traveled that distance, No other British armored car had served on every major front where British forces operated North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany. The vehicle that was not supposed to exist had outlasted every alternative. The war in Europe ended 6 days after the 11th Hussars drove into Hamburg. The Daimler armored car had done what it was built to do. The question now was what happened to it after. The answer was not what anyone expected. In the years immediately following the war, the British Army began the institutional process of deciding what the next generation of equipment would look like. The Daimler was wartime production, wartime engineering, designed under the pressures of an emergency that no longer existed. Surely the peacetime army could do better. The Coventry armored car was developed as the Daimler's replacement. It was a reasonable vehicle on paper. New design, fresh thinking, incorporating lessons from 6 years of combat experience. The Army expected it to supersede the Daimler quickly and decisively. Testing began. Evaluations were conducted. Reports were written. The report said the same thing from every evaluation: the Daimler was still better. Not marginally better, better in the ways that mattered to the crews who would actually operate these vehicles. Better in cross-country mobility, better in mechanical reliability, better in the transmission behavior that gave drivers confidence in difficult terrain. The Coventry was newer. The Daimler was superior. 220 Coventry armored cars were built. Then production was canceled. The vehicle designed to replace the Daimler was itself replaced by the vehicle it was supposed to have made obsolete. This is not a story that defense procurement programs like to tell about themselves. The implication is uncomfortable that the wartime design, produced in dispersed factories under bombing raids and material shortages and the pressure of an ongoing war, was better than the considered peacetime design that followed it. That the emergency solution was more durable than the planned solution. The British Army kept the Daimler in service. B Squadron of the 11th Hussars, the regiment that had taken the first Daimlers into combat in 1942, was still operating the same model of vehicle in Northern Ireland in January 1960. 15 years after the end of the war, more than 2 decades after the engineering team at the Daimler Company began drawing up a vehicle that conventional wisdom said could not be made to work. That is not longevity by plan. That is longevity by performance. The vehicle kept justifying itself, year after year, in conditions that had nothing to do with the North African desert or the bocage of Normandy, because the engineering was sound enough to remain useful in situations its designers never imagined. The Daimler's post-war service was not confined to Britain. It spread across the map of a world that was reorganizing itself after the largest conflict in human history, and it found new work in places and conditions that would have seemed surreal to the crews who had first driven it in Libya. India received Daimlers as part of the transition from British colonial administration to independence. The 63rd Cavalry and the President's Bodyguard operated them, and when the border with China became a combat zone in 1962, the vehicles went there too. The Sino-Indian War was fought in the Himalayas, at altitudes, and in terrain conditions that were the opposite of everything the Daimler had been tested against in North Africa: mountain passes instead of open desert, cold thin air instead of dry heat, roads that were tracks and tracks that were barely distinguishable from the mountainside. The Daimler worked, not because it was designed for that environment. It was not, but because the engineering principles that made it effective in the desert, the independent suspension, the torque multiplication at the wheel hubs, the pre-selector gearbox that gave drivers control without demanding technical perfection under stress, those principles were not desert-specific. They were sound engineering, and sound engineering transfers. Malaysia used Daimlers throughout the Malayan emergency, from 1948 to 1960. The emergency was a counterinsurgency campaign against communist guerrillas operating in dense jungle terrain. The tactical problems were entirely different from anything the vehicle had faced in conventional warfare. Ambushes from concealed positions, roads that could hide mines, terrain that channeled movement into predictable corridors and made the kind of wide flanking maneuvers that the desert had rewarded nearly impossible. And yet the Daimler was useful. Its firepower was more than anything the guerrillas could easily oppose. Its mechanical reliability meant it could operate in the humidity and mud and heat of the Malaysian jungle without the constant breakdown problems that plagued less robust designs. The vehicle that had been designed to fight German armored cars in open desert was now doing good work on a different continent, in a different kind of war. 2 decades after its design was first committed to paper, Sri Lanka received 12 Daimlers in 1959. They were used through the 1971 insurrection. Some were kept operational into the late 1990s, 1990-something, nearly 60 years after the engineering team in Coventry solved the problem that everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. In some Sri Lankan maintenance depot, mechanics were still working on the pre-selector gearboxes and the disc brakes and the H-drive transmissions that had been engineered to survive the Second World War. There are weapons that last because they are hoarded and preserved. There are weapons that last because they are never used hard enough to wear out. And then there are weapons that last because they are so fundamentally correctly designed that they remain useful decades after the conditions they were designed for have ceased to exist. The Daimler was the third kind. Third, there is a detail about the Little John adapter that belongs in this post-war accounting because it says something that the combat record alone does not fully capture. The adapter was designed by a Czech engineer. It was adopted by the British Army for use on a vehicle designed by a team at Daimler's Coventry Works to fire a gun whose configuration drew on the light tank engineering lineage. The ammunition it required was made from tungsten, a material that had to be carefully rationed because global supply was limited and multiple military applications were competing for it. This accumulation of improvisation, borrowing, adaptation, and constraint is not a story about a weapon system developed according to a coherent master plan. It is a story about what happens when people with genuine engineering competence are given real problems and the freedom to solve them without being told in advance which solutions are permitted. The Little John adapter did not transform the Daimler into a tank destroyer. It made the 2-pounder gun more useful for a specific set of circumstances, at the cost of flexibility in other circumstances, and it required nothing more than attaching a device to the end of an existing barrel. That is what capable engineering allows. It allows the people who depend on the equipment to adapt it, not to redesign it from scratch, not to wait for a procurement process that might deliver something better in 18 months, to adapt it now, in the field, with what is available, because the foundation is solid enough to support the addition. Every modification the Daimler absorbed during its service life, the SOD deturreted command variants in Normandy, the Little John adapter in Northwest Europe, the operations in Malaysian jungle and Himalayan passes, worked because the original design had been correct at its foundation. The vehicle did not succeed because it was infinitely flexible. It succeeded because the things it did well were so fundamentally correct that they remained useful across an extraordinary range of conditions. That is a harder thing to design than a vehicle that does one thing perfectly. The Ferret armored car entered British service in the early 1950s as the Daimler's formal successor within the reconnaissance role. It was a lighter vehicle, smaller, faster, designed for the post-war operational environment that the Cold War was already shaping. It shared the H-drive transmission with the Daimler. It shared the pre-selector gearbox. It shared the philosophy of low silhouette, mechanical reliability, and handling characteristics that gave drivers genuine confidence at speed and in difficult terrain. The Ferret was not the Daimler. It was a different vehicle for a different era. But the engineering principles that made the Daimler effective were present in the Ferret, carried forward not as nostalgia, but as demonstrated solutions to problems that had not changed simply because the war had ended. The lineage does not stop there. The vehicles that followed in later decades, the armored cars built for armies that had learned from the Second World War that a wheeled vehicle could carry genuine anti-armor capability without sacrificing the mobility that made it useful. carried the same fundamental argument in their designs. The South African Ruicat, the French AMX-10RC, the Italian Centauro. None of these vehicles were designed with the Daimler as a direct model. But all of them exist because the argument the Daimler made in 1941 was eventually accepted as true by every serious military. Wheeled vehicles can fight. Reconnaissance units do not have to be helpless. The armored car that hunts is more valuable than the armored car that only hides. These are not radical propositions. They seem obvious now. They were not obvious in 1939. They were not obvious in 1941, when the vehicle that would prove them was being assembled by workers who had never seen a military vehicle in their lives, in factories that had been making entirely different things the month before. 2,694 Daimler armored cars were built between 1941 and 1945. 41 survive today. That number sits differently depending on how you look at it. 41 out of nearly 3,000, less than 2%. From a preservation standpoint, it is a significant loss. Vehicles that carried men through the most violent years of the 20th century have been scrapped, worn out, buried, or simply lost to the record. But consider the other interpretation. 98.5% of these vehicles were used until they were gone, not preserved, not retired carefully, used until they broke down for the last time, or were destroyed by the enemy, or were worn through so many repairs that the cost of another repair exceeded the value of the vehicle. They were used in North Africa and in the Italian mountains and in the Bocage and in Malaysian jungle and in the Himalayas and in Sri Lanka. And they kept being used because they kept working. And they kept working until they did not. A weapon that lasts in museums is a weapon that was preserved. A weapon that lasts in service is a weapon that was needed. The Daimler was needed. In places and for purposes that no one planned when the first one rolled off a dispersed production line in 1941, it was needed. And it was there. And it worked. 41 remain. In museums, in private collections, in the care of people who understand what they are holding. The 41 are the survivors of a population that was consumed by use across 50 years of continuous service. They are not remnants. They are evidence. In 1939, the conventional wisdom was clear. You could build a fast armored car. You could build a well-armed armored car. You could not build both. The physics would not allow it. The engineering would not support it. Every attempt had failed. Every expert agreed. Daimler's engineers asked a different question. Not, can we build a better scout car? But why does a scout car have to be helpless? The distinction matters because it reframes the entire problem. A better scout car is still a car that runs away from trouble more efficiently. A scout car that does not have to be helpless is something else entirely. It is a vehicle that gives its crew a choice, and choices in combat are the difference between men who can act and men who can only react. The 11th Hussars chose to engage when engagement made sense. Roger de Wandre chose to drive calamity down the streets of Brussels at the tip of a liberation that he had not been certain 4 years earlier would ever come. The household cavalry crews chose to find the route to Driel and link with the Polish paratroopers, even knowing that the operation they were supporting was failing around them. Choices made by men and vehicles that gave them something to choose with. The desert did not reveal the Daimler's character. The desert confirmed it. The character was built into the engineering long before the first patrol went out, before the first shot was fired, before the first crew discovered that their vehicle could do what no previous vehicle had allowed them to do. It was built into the design by people who refused to accept the answer that everyone else had accepted. That refusal is the reason the vehicle existed. That refusal is the reason it worked. And that refusal is the reason that, decades after the men who built it and drove it and depended on it were gone, a mechanic in a Sri Lankan maintenance depot was still working on the gearbox of a vehicle designed in Coventry in 1939, because the answer had been correct. Not perfect, not the finest armored car ever produced by any nation, not the best on paper, not the vehicle that post-war analysts would point to as the theoretical ideal, but correct. Correct in the way that matters most. It did what it was supposed to do for the people it was supposed to do it for, across conditions that no one predicted and for longer than anyone planned. Nearly 3,000 built, 41 remaining. The strange British armored car that hunted tanks instead of running from them was not strange at all. It was the answer to a question that everyone else had stopped asking, and the answer held. For 50 years, across 3 continents, through the Second World War, and 3 conflicts that came after it, in desert and jungle and mountain and city, in the hands of British crews and Belgian crews and Indian crews and Malaysian crews and Sri Lankan crews, through a procurement process that canceled its own replacement and kept the original in service by default, through adaptations that no designer anticipated and modifications that no manual described. The answer held, because the question had been asked correctly, and that, in the end, is the only engineering lesson that matters.